Hey guys, tonight we're going to dive into some of the most epic stories from the ancient world, from the blood-soaked sands of Rome to the smoky firelight of a Saxon hall. We'll unpack history's greatest stories, the ones that feel both impossibly distant and strangely familiar. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It helps the channel more than you know. And as we get started, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, creating this quiet, global community in the late hours of the night. Now go ahead and dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We have a long road ahead of us, filled with crumbling crowns and warriors' feasts, and I'm glad you're here to travel it with me. Our journey tonight is really a journey through different kinds of power and different kinds of community. We often think of history as a list of dates and battles, a dry collection of facts that feel disconnected from our own lives. But that's not what history is. History is a collection of stories about people who lived and breathed, who feared the dark and celebrated the harvest, who built monuments to their own glory and huddled together for warmth. Tonight, we're going to step inside 4 of those stories. We'll see how a building can become a weapon of propaganda, how an army's greatest strength can be found in its kitchen, how a single room can be the center of an entire culture, and how the ancient rhythms of the sun and seasons are still secretly woven into the fabric of our own modern lives. These are not just tales of what happened long ago, they are the foundational myths of the world we inherited, and their echoes are everywhere if you just know where to listen. We'll start with a ruin you all know and love, one of the most iconic buildings ever constructed, the Colosseum of Rome. But we're not going to see it as the broken tourist magnet it is today. We're going to see it as the Romans did in the year 80 CE, when it first opened its doors. Back then, it wasn't a silent skeleton of stone. It was the Beyoncé of Roman architecture, flawless, dramatic, and guaranteed to make the neighbors jealous. Clad in so much bright travertine limestone and marble you probably needed sunglasses, it was a perfect, uncracked, gleaming monument to Roman power. It screamed permanence, and yet, today, half of it is gone, vanished. So the first great story we'll unpack is a mystery: what happened to the missing half of the Colosseum? The answer isn't what you think. It wasn't just time or neglect. It was a story of earthquakes, ambition, and the greatest stone heist in history, a tale that reveals how Rome ended up devouring its own greatest symbol. From that monumental arena, we'll march with the legions that built that empire. When we picture a Roman legionary, we see the glint of steel, the eagle standards, the thunder of marching boots. But we're going to look past the sword and shield to find the true engine of Roman conquest. We're going to find out what really fueled their legendary marches, what gave them the endurance to build an empire that stretched from the drizzly fields of Britain to the sun-scorched deserts of Syria. The secret wasn't just discipline, it was dinner. We'll uncover the brutally efficient diet of the common soldier, a story of grain, salt, vinegar, and a sour wine drink that was the ancient world's Gatorade. We'll discover that an army truly does march on its stomach, and that the Roman Empire was forged just as much around the camp cook fire as it was on the battlefield. After that, we're leaving the Mediterranean world behind and heading north, into the misty forests and cold winters of the Anglo-Saxons. Our destination is the very heart of their society, the Mead Hall. From the outside, these were simple, long wooden halls with steep thatched roofs. But inside, they were the center of the warrior world. We'll step into that dark, smoky warmth, into a room dominated by a great central fire that never seemed to die. This was the world of Beowulf, a world bound by oaths of loyalty, where a lord's power was measured by his generosity, and where a warrior's only hope for immortality rested on the tongue of the poet, the scop, whose songs echoed in the smoky rafters for generations to come. It was a place where community was forged in mead, words, and shared warmth against the encroaching darkness. And finally, from the heart of their halls, we'll explore the very heart of their worldview by turning the wheel of the year. For the Anglo-Saxons, time wasn't a straight line but a circle, a rhythm of planting and harvest, of long, dark nights and bright, hopeful days. We'll explore the ancient festivals that marked their year, a cycle of fire and feasting that held their world together. We'll join them for the defiant 12-day party of Yule at the winter solstice and celebrate the return of the light at the spring festival of Easter. And in doing so, we'll uncover one of history's most fascinating secrets, how these pagan rituals were not destroyed by Christianity, but absorbed, leaving behind a faint but fascinating echo in our own holidays today, from the Yule log at Christmas to the very name of Easter. So that is our path for tonight, from the spectacle of a Roman amphitheatre to the quiet fellowship of a Saxon feast. From the rations of an empire builder to the rituals that tied a people to the turning of the seasons. These stories are all connected, threads in the great tapestry of our shared past. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the noise of the modern world fade away. It's time to let the quiet stories of the ancient world speak. Our journey begins now in the heart of Rome, beside a broken crown of stone that once held the world captive. When the Colosseum opened its doors in the year 80 CE, it wasn't the half-broken, beautifully scarred ruin we see today. Before we go any further, I want you to try and erase that image from your mind. Forget the jagged edges, the exposed inner walls, the quiet dignity of a monument worn down by time. Instead, I want you to picture it as it was on that first day, standing under the Roman sun. It was perfect, absolutely, flawlessly perfect. It was less a building and more a declaration, a crown jewel of an empire at the absolute peak of its power. Back then, as the narrator in our original story so perfectly put it, it was the Beyoncé of Roman architecture, flawless, dramatic, and guaranteed to make the neighbors jealous. Its entire exterior was sheathed in gleaming, honey-colored travertine limestone and brilliant white marble, polished so brightly that on a sunny day, you probably would have needed sunglasses to look directly at it. Imagine walking through the bustling, dusty streets of ancient Rome, turning a corner, and being confronted by this mountain of light. It would have been breathtaking, almost blinding. There were no missing pieces, no rubble piles, no lonely goats grazing where emperors once sat. It was whole, round, and uncracked, a symbol of an empire that truly believed it would last forever. Its official name wasn't even the Colosseum. That was a nickname that came later. Officially, it was called the Flavian Amphitheatre, a formal, stately name that paid tribute to the family dynasty of emperors who built it. Vespasian and his sons, Titus and Domitian. It was their family project, their legacy stamped in stone. But nobody in the street bothered with a mouthful like Flavian Amphitheatre. It sounded too much like a bad law firm. Romans just pointed and said, the Colosseum. That nickname stuck, and the reason why is a story in itself. It wasn't just because the building was colossal in size, though it certainly was. The name was also a constant, lingering nod to a truly gigantic statue that stood right nearby. This wasn't just any statue, it was a 100-foot-tall bronze behemoth of the disgraced, despised Emperor Nero. After Nero's scandalous reign ended, his successors, the Flavians, had to figure out what to do with this monstrous monument to a tyrant. In a brilliant PR move, they didn't tear it down. Instead, they cleverly repurposed it, swapping out Nero's head and making it look like the sun god's soul. So for centuries, this colossal statue of a sun god stood guard next to the colossal amphitheatre. The two became linked in the public mind, and soon enough, everyone was just calling the building by the statue's most obvious feature, its colossal size. And the thing truly was enormous. Let's just try to wrap our minds around the scale here. Modern estimates suggest it could hold somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators. That's the capacity of a modern NFL stadium. Imagine that many people, all packed into a single structure nearly 2,000 years ago. To get them all in and out, the building had 80 different entrances at ground level, a masterpiece of ancient crowd control that meant the entire stadium could fill up or empty out in a surprisingly short amount of time. The exterior was a stack of 3 stories of towering arches, rising 157 feet into the air, with a 4th story at the top that was mostly solid wall, punctuated by windows. In the arches of the 2nd and 3rd floors, there would have stood hundreds of larger-than-life statues, probably of gods and heroes, gazing down on the crowds below. The whole structure was the ultimate status symbol, an arena built for one simple purpose: to show the entire world that Rome had more concrete, more money, more engineering genius, and more free time than anyone else on Earth. It was a flex, plain and simple, a monument built to intimidate and awe in equal measure. Inside, the spectacle was just as carefully designed. The seating arrangement wasn't first come, first served. It was a perfect, rigid reflection of Roman society. Your seat was determined by your status, and there was no faking it. Down at the very bottom, in the best seats right next to the action, sat the senators, their names literally carved into the stone. A little higher up were the nobles and knights. As you moved up the tiers, the social status went down. The higher you sat, the less important you were. All the way at the very top, in the cheap seats, the ancient equivalent of the nosebleeds, were the common poor, the slaves, and the women, all squashed together on steep wooden benches. But no matter where you sat, whether you were a powerful senator lounging on a marble seat or a peasant squinting from the rafters, everyone got the same blood-splattered view, and that was the point. It brought the entire city together, from the highest to the lowest, to witness the same state-sponsored spectacle of power and death, all while reinforcing the social order that kept everyone in their place. The building itself was a marvel of Roman engineering, a testament to their mastery of construction. It was built with a clever framework of travertine limestone blocks for the main pillars and arches, filled in with less expensive volcanic tuff and brick, and all of it was bound together with the Romans' secret weapon concrete. But what truly held this massive structure together were an estimated 300 tons of iron clamps. These clamps were like giant metal staples, locking the huge stone blocks together, preventing them from shifting or pulling apart under the immense weight. This intricate skeleton of stone and iron was what allowed the building to stand for so long. When you look at the ruin today, you can still see the holes where those clamps used to be, little pockmarks that tell a story of how the building was later picked apart. But back then, in its prime, this complex system was invisible, hidden within the seamless, perfect facade. The whole structure just screamed permanence. It looked like it was carved from a single mountain, not assembled piece by piece. If you had told a Roman citizen, standing there in awe, that this perfect circle of stone would one day lose half its body, they would have laughed in your face and probably ordered another round of executions. Because in ancient Rome, the word forever wasn't just a hopeful expression. It was an engineering principle, at least until the earthquakes showed up. That perfect, gleaming monument we just pictured didn't just appear out of nowhere. The story of where it was built, the very ground it stands on, is a masterclass in political public relations, a stroke of genius that shows just how savvy the Romans were at spinning a story. To understand it, we have to go back a few years before the first stone of the Colosseum was ever laid, back to the chaotic and fiery reign of Emperor Nero. In the year 64 CE, a catastrophic fire swept through Rome. The Great Fire of Rome, it came to be called. It burned for over a week, and when the smoke finally cleared, huge swaths of the city were nothing but ash and rubble. Homes, temples, entire neighborhoods, gone. And in the aftermath, as the people of Rome were picking through the ruins of their lives, rumors started to fly. Whispers that the emperor himself, the erratic and fame-obsessed Nero, had started the fire so he could clear land to build a glorious new palace. Whether he actually did it or not is something historians still debate, But in the court of public opinion, Nero was guilty, and he did absolutely nothing to help his case. Because what did Nero do with all that newly available, tragically cleared land right in the heart of the city? He seized it, a huge chunk of it. And on that land, where the homes of Roman citizens once stood, he began to build the most ridiculously over-the-top private palace imaginable. He called it the Domus Aurea, which means the Golden House. And that was an understatement. This wasn't a palace, it was a private city. It sprawled over hundreds of acres, with parks, gardens, vineyards, and even a private zoo. The main villa was legendary for its decadence. We're talking walls covered in gold leaf and precious gems, ceilings inlaid with ivory panels that could slide open to shower guests with flowers and perfume, and a circular dining room with a ceiling that revolved day and night, mimicking the heavens. It was the ultimate symbol of a ruler who saw himself not as a public servant, but as a living god, completely detached from the people he ruled. But the most audacious part of the whole project, the feature that must have felt like a daily slap in the face to the average Roman, was the enormous artificial lake Nero had constructed right in the valley at the heart of his new estate. Imagine, in a crowded, thirsty city like Rome, a single man building himself a private sea, a place for his party barges to float while the rest of the city looked on. This lake, this symbol of tyrannical excess, was built right on the very spot where the Colosseum now stands. For years, it was the centerpiece of Nero's private paradise, a playground built on the ashes of a public tragedy. But Nero's scandalous reign, filled with paranoia, political murders, and artistic vanity, couldn't last. The empire rose up against him, and he was eventually declared an enemy of the state and forced to take his own life. His death plunged Rome into a bloody year of civil war, with 4 different emperors taking the throne in quick succession. Out of that chaos emerged a new emperor, a tough, practical, no-nonsense general named Vespasian. He was the founder of the new Flavian dynasty, and he had a serious problem. He needed to restore order, heal a traumatized city, and most importantly, distance himself and his new regime from the hated memory of Nero. He needed to show the people of Rome that a new day had dawned, that the era of selfish tyrants was over, and he found the perfect way to do it. He looked at Nero's sprawling, decadent golden house, the ultimate symbol of private greed, and he made a brilliant move. He decided to give it back to the people. He started tearing down parts of the palace, and he took its most offensive feature, that massive, private, artificial lake, and he had it drained. This was the first step in his master plan. Then Vespasian made a public declaration that must have sounded like music to the ears of the Roman people. He announced that on the very ground where a tyrant had built his private playground, he would construct a massive public amphitheater, a place of entertainment for everyone, rich and poor alike. Can you imagine the power of that gesture? It was pure political theatre of the highest order. He was taking the ultimate symbol of Nero's stolen luxury and transforming it into the ultimate symbol of public generosity. It was a powerful, populist statement that said, "The land that Nero stole from you, I am now giving back." He was literally and metaphorically burying the memory of the old regime under a new monument dedicated to the people. Every stone that would be laid for the new amphitheater would be a stone placed on the grave of Nero's legacy. The cheers of 50,000 spectators would one day echo in the very same valley where a despised emperor had once floated alone on his party barge. With this single decision, Vespasian didn't just commission a new building, he won the hearts of the Roman people and cemented the legitimacy of his new dynasty. But, as we'll soon see, this grand gift to the public, this populist masterpiece built on the ghost of a tyrant's dream, had a dark origin story all its own. The money and the labor had to come from somewhere, and that story begins not in Rome, but in a brutal war in a faraway land. But this grand gesture, this populist masterpiece built on the ghost of a tyrant's dream, had a dark origin story all its own. Grand gifts always come with a price tag, and the Colosseum was the grandest gift of them all. So you have to ask the question, where did Vespasian get the money? He was a new emperor who had inherited a treasury left empty by Nero's excesses and a brutal year of civil war. Building the largest, most ambitious amphitheater in the world would cost a fortune. The answer is simple, and it's brutal. The Colosseum wasn't paid for with Roman taxes. It was funded almost entirely by the treasures looted during a distant and bloody war. It was a monument built on the spoils of conquest, a victory trophy paid for with the wealth of a conquered nation. That nation was Judea, and the conflict was the First Jewish-Roman War, a bitter and desperate rebellion that had raged for years. The final, brutal act of that war was the siege and sack of Jerusalem in the year 70 CE, an event led by Vespasian's own son and heir Titus. After a long and grueling siege, the Roman legions breached the city's walls and unleashed hell. They tore the city apart, and most significantly, they looted and destroyed the Second Temple, the absolute holiest site in Judaism. From the temple treasury, they carted away unimaginable wealth. We're talking about solid gold artifacts, including the famous seven-branched menorah, the golden table of shewbread, silver trumpets, and countless other sacred vessels. This wasn't just plunder, it was the symbolic dismantling of a culture's spiritual heart. When Titus returned to Rome, he held a massive triumphal parade, and these sacred treasures were paraded through the streets for the entire city to see. This wasn't just a celebration of military victory, it was a display of the massive injection of cash that would now fund the empire's next great project, their new amphitheater. And the Romans weren't even remotely shy about it. They didn't try to hide the source of the funding. In fact, they advertised it. In one of history's most chillingly honest public statements, an inscription was found on a block of stone at the site, which has since been reconstructed. It literally stated that the Emperor Vespasian ordered the new amphitheater to be built from his generals' share of the booty. Think about that. It was right there in black and white, carved in stone for all to see. They were proud of it. The message was clear and unambiguous. Our legions went to a foreign land, crushed a rebellion, and brought back so much wealth that we can afford to build you, the people of Rome, the greatest stadium the world has ever seen. The building itself was a constant, gleaming reminder of Roman military might and the profitability of empire. But the spoils of war weren't just financial. The war also provided the second crucial ingredient for a project of this scale, the labor. The massive, back-breaking work of quarrying the stone, hauling the massive blocks of travertine, and raising the towering arches was done by a workforce largely made up of thousands of prisoners of war, brought back from that same conflict. Historical sources suggest that tens of thousands of Jewish captives were brought to Rome after the war. While many were sold into the general slave market, a huge number were put to work on the emperor's new building projects, with the Colosseum being the crown jewel. Imagine the crushing irony of that. You survive a horrific war that destroys your home and your holiest shrine. You are marched in chains across the sea to the capital of the empire that conquered you, and then you are forced, day after grueling day, to build a monument celebrating your own people's defeat. The very stones of the Colosseum were put in place by the hands of the conquered, a silent, tragic testament to the human cost of the spectacle that would one day take place within its walls. This is what reveals the Colosseum for what it truly was: a perfect, self-sustaining propaganda engine. The whole system was a brilliant and brutal cycle. It worked like this: first, a brutal war of conquest in a faraway land generates two things: immense wealth from looting and a massive source of free labor from prisoners. Second, the emperor then uses that wealth and that labor to build a spectacular public venue on land that he cleverly reclaimed from a hated tyrant, making him look like a hero. And finally, he throws open the doors of this new venue and offers the population free entry and free food. The famous policy of bread and circuses, to keep them happy, distracted, and thoroughly entertained. It created a powerful and addictive feedback loop. Foreign conquest directly paid for domestic entertainment, which in turn reinforced the popular idea that empire was great for the average Roman. Their fun was being directly subsidized by the plunder of foreign nations. The building was more than just an arena. It was a physical manifestation of the Roman imperial business model. And when this monument, paid for in blood and treasure, was finally finished, the Emperor Titus would inaugurate it with a spectacle of carnage so vast it would set the tone for the next 4 centuries. So, this monument, this grand populist gesture paid for with the spoils of war and built by the hands of prisoners, was finally complete. Construction had begun under the Emperor Vespasian, and after his death, it was finished by his son, Titus. And when Titus cut the ribbon in the year 80 CE, he knew he had to do something spectacular to inaugurate it. A simple parade or a few games wouldn't do. This building was a statement, and its opening had to be a statement of overwhelming, undeniable, almost terrifying Roman power. He didn't settle for a casual opening ceremony. He didn't host a weekend-long festival. Instead, Titus hosted 100 straight days of entertainment. Let that sink in for a moment. For over 3 months, the city of Rome revolved around a non-stop spectacle of bloodshed. As the original narrator said, picture Netflix autoplay, but with more stabbing. Every single day, the gates would open, the crowds would pour in, and the sand of the arena floor would be soaked anew. It was a season of slaughter, a marathon of death designed to both entertain and intimidate the entire world. The sheer scale of the carnage during those opening games is difficult for us to even comprehend. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing about a century later, claimed that over 9,000 wild animals were killed during these inaugural games alone. Another source puts the number at a slightly more conservative, but still staggering, 5,000. This wasn't just a handful of lions pitted against a few gladiators. This was a systematic, industrial-scale extermination of wildlife, and it was meant to be a display of the empire's vast reach. The games were a living map of the Roman world. They shipped in animals from every corner of the known world, a logistical feat that was as impressive as it was horrifying. There were lions and leopards from the plains of Africa, bears hauled down from the mountains of Europe, tigers from the distant east, massive war elephants, and crocodiles dredged from the mud of the Nile. They even managed to get their hands on a rhinoceros, a creature that must have looked like a living myth to the people of Rome. The Colosseum during those 100 days was basically Noah's Ark. If Noah had been a psychopath with a taste for dramatic irony, none of these creatures lasted long, of course. They endured weeks of miserable transport in cramped cages, only to be butchered as a halftime show. And as if that wasn't enough, Titus and his engineers had another trick up their sleeve, a spectacle so audacious, so over the top that it has become legendary. It was a particularly, because we can, moment. In the middle of this brand new, state-of-the-art stone stadium, they decided to stage full-scale mock naval battles, or nomatia. They flooded the entire arena floor. Modern hydraulic studies suggest that by using a direct connection to the nearby Claudian aqueduct, Roman engineers could have filled the arena with several feet of water in just a few hours, creating a temporary, indoor murder lake. Imagine the scene. The crowd, who had just been watching a lion hunt on dry sand, now watched as the arena floor transformed into a shimmering pool. They brought in specially designed, flat-bottomed ships, and crews of gladiators or condemned criminals, dressed as rival Greek and Persian sailors, would fight to the death, reenacting famous sea battles from history for a cheering crowd. They even had specially trained animals, like horses and bulls, that were taught to perform in the shallow water. It was the ultimate display of engineering prowess. But this incredible spectacle was also incredibly complex and damaging to the building's substructure. It was a logistical nightmare, and after Emperor Domitian built a permanent network of tunnels and cells beneath the arena floor a decade later, the naval battles were discontinued for good. They were a one-time only, or at least a very rare, display of a new emperor showing off what his incredible new toy could do. And all of this spectacle, the animal hunts and the naval battles, served a very practical, if grim, purpose in the Roman economy. Over the centuries it was in use, it's estimated that 500,000 people and over 1 million animals died within those walls. Think about that, 1 million dead animals. In a city where red meat was a luxury for most of the population, all of those carcasses didn't just go to waste. Historical accounts and common sense suggest that the meat from the thousands of animals killed in the games was often distributed to the crowd in mass giveaways or sold at the city's markets. The poor got free bread and free gore, and sometimes they got free dinner too. The Colosseum wasn't just Rome's greatest slaughterhouse, it was also, indirectly, its biggest butcher shop. These inaugural games set the bloody precedent. They established the Colosseum as the new, beating heart of the city, a place where the power of the empire was put on daily display. It was a demonstration of Rome's incredible reach, seen in the exotic animals dragged from the ends of the earth. It was a display of their engineering genius, seen in the impossible feat of a naval battle in a stadium, and it was a chilling display of their absolute command over life and death. But what the cheering crowd saw was only half the show. The real magic, the real mechanical genius that made all this impossible carnage a daily reality, was happening right beneath their feet, in a dark, cramped, and terrifying world they would never see. The Colosseum's glory days, those centuries of thunderous applause and unrelenting carnage, didn't end with a dramatic final bang. There was no epic last battle, no grand closing ceremony. Instead, its long reign as the empire's bloody heart ended with a quiet, drawn-out, almost indifferent shrug. The roar of 80,000 spectators didn't fall silent overnight. It just faded, year by year, decade by decade, until one day there was nothing left but the wind whistling through the empty arches. The mighty engine of entertainment sputtered, coughed, and then slowly, unceremoniously died. To understand why, you have to look outside the walls of the arena and at the world that was crumbling around it. By the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was in a state of terminal decline. It had far more pressing problems than figuring out how to fund the next lion hunt. The empire was fighting for its life on a dozen fronts. Barbarian tribes, who the Romans had once dismissed as savages, were no longer just a nuisance at the frontiers, they were a mortal threat. The city of Rome itself, the supposedly eternal and inviolable heart of the world, was sacked by the Visigoths in the year 410. It was a psychological blow from which the empire never truly recovered. When your capital city is being looted, the budget for importing crocodiles from Egypt tends to get cut. At the same time, the political situation was a chaotic mess. The days of stable, long-reigning emperors were a distant memory. Emperors were now being assassinated with the grim regularity of a Monday morning. Power was a revolving door of generals and usurpers, and the constant civil wars drained the state of soldiers and money. The imperial treasury, which had once overflowed with the wealth of conquered nations, was emptier than a peasant's breadbasket. The complex and incredibly expensive logistical network required to stage the games, capturing exotic animals, training gladiators, maintaining the massive structure, had simply broken down. The empire couldn't afford its favorite pastime anymore. Amidst this backdrop of chaos and collapse, the games themselves began to wither. Gladiatorial combat, the main event, and the whole reason this giant stone circle existed, slowly fizzled out. The last recorded gladiator fight in the Colosseum took place in the year 404 CE. After that, the tradition that had defined Roman entertainment for centuries was over. The animal hunts limped on for about another century, becoming less and less spectacular, before they too faded into history around the mid-500s. The crowd had to find other ways to amuse itself, like rioting or complaining about taxes. There was another, deeper cultural shift happening as well: the rise of Christianity. The new faith was sweeping the empire, and its values were in direct opposition to everything the Colosseum stood for. Church leaders weren't exactly fans of treating large-scale murder as a form of family entertainment. As one of our narrators wryly noted, it's hard to preach mercy on Sunday, And then go watch a guy get eviscerated by a bear on Monday. The church's growing influence created a new moral climate where the bloody spectacles of the arena seemed increasingly depraved and pagan. And so, the once mighty stadium fell into a profound state of neglect. It became a silent giant in a crumbling city. The roars of the crowd were replaced by an eerie quiet. The stench of blood and sweat gave way to the smell of damp stone and weeds. No more emperors showing off naval battles, no more thumbs deciding who lived or died. There was just this giant, empty arena, growing quieter and more desolate with each passing year. It was as if the building itself was embarrassed to still be standing while the empire that had birthed it was circling the drain. Rome itself was a shadow of its former self, a city of magnificent ruins and dwindling population. For the people who lived there during the early Middle Ages, the Colosseum was no longer the awe-inspiring jewel of the empire. It was just that really big, crumbling thing in the middle of town. Locals would wander past it every day, probably muttering to themselves, "Somebody really should do something about that." And then they just keep walking. The saddest part is that, at this point, the Colosseum hadn't even started to lose its stones yet. The great earthquakes were still centuries away. For now, it was just suffering from neglect, like a once famous actor who was now doing beer commercials. The games were gone. The emperors were gone. And the stadium that had once screamed Rome's power to the heavens was now an oversized, silent paperweight. It stood there, mostly whole but utterly purposeless, a relic of a grander, more brutal age. Rome had stopped caring. And when Rome stopped caring, it left its greatest monument vulnerable and exposed. The building that had shrugged off centuries of constant murder didn't stand a chance against centuries of indifference. The stage was now set for its physical destruction. History was sharpening its chisels, and deep beneath the city, the earth itself was beginning to stir. The Colosseum may have shrugged off centuries of stabbing, mauling, and general blood-soaked chaos, but as the narrator of our original story warned, nothing in Rome was built to survive Mother Nature's passive-aggressive fits. For centuries, the building stood, neglected and empty, a hollow giant in a city that had forgotten its purpose. By the 9th century, the games were a distant memory, and Rome itself was a shadow of its imperial past. The great arena was vulnerable, not to an army, but to a force far more ancient and indifferent. And the earthquakes arrived, and they didn't come to spectate. They came to finish the fight. The iconic, half-broken look of the Colosseum that we know today isn't random. It's not just a product of slow decay. It's a direct result of geology, a story of a fatal flaw that was built into its very foundations from day one. To understand this flaw, we have to go all the way back to Nero's artificial lake. Remember how Emperor Vespasian cleverly drained that lake to build his new amphitheater. It was a brilliant political move, but from an engineering standpoint, it created a ticking time bomb. The northern side of the Colosseum was built on stable ground, solid clay that provided a firm footing. But the southern side was built right on top of that former lakebed. The ground there was softer, less stable alluvial soil, basically a thick, dense layer of silt, gravel, and sand that had been deposited over centuries and was still saturated with water. It was like building one half of a skyscraper on bedrock and the other half on a giant, muddy sponge. The ancient Roman engineers were geniuses, yes, but even they couldn't outsmart fault lines forever. For centuries, this fundamental weakness didn't matter. The building's incredible construction held firm, but the flaw was always there, sleeping just beneath the surface, waiting for the earth to move. And in the year 847 CE, the earth moved. A major earthquake hit the city of Rome, a violent tremor that shook the ancient monuments to their core. Inside the Colosseum, the ground shuddered. The northern side, anchored to its stable foundation, swayed and groaned but largely held its ground. But the southern side, resting on that soft, unstable soil, took the absolute worst of it. The weak foundation couldn't absorb the shock. Instead, it amplified it, sending catastrophic waves of energy up through the structure. And the southern wall, that great, majestic arc of stone and marble finally gave way. With a deafening roar that must have echoed across the 7 hills, a massive section of the outer wall simply collapsed. Massive chunks tumbled down in a cascade of rock, iron, and centuries of bad memories. It was an almost unimaginable scene of destruction. What emperors, barbarians, and popes hadn't managed to destroy. The earth itself happily kicked over like a spoiled child knocking down a sandcastle. When the dust finally settled, the Colosseum was permanently and irrevocably broken. It went from a majestic, if neglected, ruin to, well, at least half of it is still standing. The northern half clung on stubbornly, while the south now lay in a gigantic pile of rubble, leaving the building looking permanently lopsided. It became history's most dramatic before and after photo. The perfect circle shattered forever. And this wasn't a one-time event. Rome got hit by more tremors throughout the Middle Ages. Each one was like another blow to a wounded boxer, loosening more stone, widening the cracks, and sending more pieces of the crumbling southern side crashing to the ground. The building that was designed to represent eternal power was now being slowly, methodically dismantled by the earth itself, one tremor at a time. The vaulted arches buckled, ancient stairways vanished into thin air, and seating tiers that had once held thousands of spectators were now just gaping holes open to the sky. But here is where the story takes a crucial turn. For the Romans of the time, this catastrophic collapse wasn't a tragedy. They didn't mourn the loss of their great monument. For them, it was an opportunity. They looked at the mountains of rubble, the huge slabs of perfectly cut travertine lying around in neat piles, and they saw a gift. Why mourn a broken amphitheatre when you could turn its ribs into the facade for your new church? Each earthquake, big or small, just added to the stockpile. Every tremor turned the Colosseum into the world's biggest and most convenient clearance sale. What had once been an engineering marvel now became a cracked skeleton, its bones politely delivered to the rest of Rome, one tremor at a time. After the Great Quake of 847, the missing half of the Colosseum wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was already becoming a reality, a gigantic, pre-cut quarry lying in the heart of the city, just waiting for the looters and builders to arrive. The Colosseum survived its first big earthquake in 847 CE, looking a bit battered but still recognizable. It was like a heavyweight fighter after a rough round, bruised, bleeding, and unsteady on its feet, but it could still stand in the ring. For nearly 500 years after that first big shove from the earth, it remained in this wounded state, a lopsided giant presiding over the quiet, medieval life of Rome. The city itself had changed dramatically. The grandeur of the empire was a distant, half-forgotten dream. Rome was now a smaller, poorer city, a landscape of ancient ruins repurposed for daily life. The Colosseum was just the biggest ruin of them all, a familiar, broken landmark that had been part of the skyline for as long as anyone could remember. But the earth wasn't done swinging. That first quake was just a jab. The knockout punch was still to come. In the year 1349, Rome got hit again, and this wasn't just another tremor. This was a catastrophic, violent quake that ripped through central Italy with enough force to topple bell towers and shatter castles. For the Colosseum, it was the fatal blow. The southern side, already weakened by that first earthquake 5 centuries earlier, and resting on its fatally flawed foundation, stood no chance. This time, it wasn't just a few sections tumbling down. Entire portions of those majestic arches and seating tiers, structures that had stood for over 1,000 years, simply folded and collapsed. The damage was absolute. It wasn't just cracks and cosmetic bruises anymore. It was, as our narrator described it, structural annihilation. The great amphitheatre, once a perfect circle, now looked like a half-eaten cake, a jagged, ruined crescent open to the elements. Rome's most famous landmark had been permanently disfigured, and nobody was rushing to bake the missing half back. But here is the most important part of the story, the twist that sealed the Colosseum's fate. The medieval Romans who survived the quake and came out to survey the damage didn't view this as a tragedy. They didn't see the loss of a priceless historical monument. They saw it as a divine delivery. Imagine their perspective. You're a builder or a stonemason in 14th century Rome. Your job is to build new palaces and churches. High quality, pre-cut stone is expensive and difficult to get. You'd normally have to organize a major expedition to a distant quarry, pay for laborers to cut the stone, and then arrange for a fleet of carts to haul it all the way back to the city. It's a slow, costly, back-breaking process. Then, one afternoon, the ground shakes, and when the dust settles, a literal mountain of the finest travertine blocks in Italy is now lying conveniently on the ground, right in the middle of the city, ready to be reused. It's not a disaster, it's a miracle. It's a gift from God. And so, the people of Rome reacted accordingly. Builders, stonemasons, and all sorts of opportunists descended on the wreckage like bargain hunters at a yard sale. The ruins of the southern wall became the city's newest, hottest, and completely free of charge public quarry. Why go through the trouble of quarrying new stone when the Colosseum was practically begging you to help yourself? The earthquake didn't just break the structure, it broke the very idea that the Colosseum should remain whole. Before the quake, it was still a single, identifiable, if neglected, monument. After the quake, it was a pile of building materials. That mental shift was everything. From that point forward, its fate was sealed. Instead of even thinking about repairing it, everyone in Rome, from the common man to the most powerful popes and nobles, would treat it as a public resource, a giant stone bank from which they could all make withdrawals. The damage from the 1349 quake was so extensive that the Colosseum never really recovered. The south side would remain a jagged, open wound, while the north side, on its sturdier foundation, would soldier on in stubborn defiance. It was this event, this final catastrophic tremor, that gave the Colosseum the dramatic, half-missing profile we recognize today. It wasn't the slow decline of the Roman Empire, not the invading barbarians, not the centuries of blood-soaked games. No, the fatal blow was the ground itself shrugging and saying, "Enough." The missing half of the Colosseum wasn't carefully dismantled, it was delivered in one catastrophic event. And from that day on, its stones would begin a new journey, carted off piece by piece to be scattered like confetti across the eternal city, hiding in plain sight in the walls of palaces, churches, and fountains for centuries to come. Rome never looked at its greatest monument the same way again. The earth had delivered the rubble. Now, for the next few hundred years, the people of Rome would come to pick up their delivery. After the Great Quake of 1349, the Colosseum wasn't seen as a wounded masterpiece anymore. To the practical, unsentimental people of medieval Rome, it was now a very convenient and very large pile of free construction materials. Rome had officially rebranded its greatest arena from an imperial monument to a public quarry. Think about it. Why would you trek out to distant stone quarries, a journey that was both expensive and dangerous, when the finest, pre-cut travertine blocks in all of Italy were just lying around in the middle of the city? There was no back-breaking labor of cutting the stone from the earth, no complicated transportation problems. You just had to stroll over to the giant, half-broken stadium, pry out a few stones, or simply pick them up from the rubble, and you were in business. And so began the Great Colosseum stone heist, a slow and systematic dismantling that would last for centuries. Everyone got in on the action. It was medieval recycling, but with less environmental guilt and a whole lot more vandalism. The noble families of Rome were the first to get in on the action. In the chaotic world of medieval Italy, power was everything, and nothing said wealth and power quite like building a gigantic, fortified palace for your family. Palaces don't build themselves, and nothing projected an image of ancient, inherited authority quite like having walls made of Colosseum marble. So, bit by bit, those magnificent fallen arches and seating tiers were carted away and reassembled into the grand mansions of Rome's elite. But some families took it a step further. They didn't just loot the stones, they moved in. The powerful Frangipani family, for example, saw the remaining structure not as a quarry, but as the perfect pre-built fortress. They fortified parts of the ruin, walled off sections of the ancient arches, and literally turned the Colosseum into their own private castle. Forget gladiators and roaring crowds. Picture instead silk-robed nobles sipping wine in the very same arches where lions once disemboweled criminals. It was a bizarre mashup of luxury living and what you might call squatter chic. It was like turning the Eiffel Tower into a condo complex or renting out the Great Pyramid on Airbnb. They weren't interested in restoration, they were interested in using the Colosseum's sheer bulk to project power. But while the nobles were shameless about squatting in the ruin, the popes were the biggest and most systematic dismantlers of them all. By the Middle Ages, the papacy had figured out that God's house looked a whole lot holier when it was decorated with stolen pagan marble. And what better source than the largest pile of high-quality stone in all of Rome? So, the Colosseum became the Vatican's unofficial quarry. For centuries, one papal project after another was built with stone and marble stripped from the amphitheatre. This leads to one of history's greatest and most delicious ironies. The Church, which had long condemned the Colosseum as a site of pagan depravity, and, according to tradition, the place where countless Christians had been martyred, now saw it as a divine hardware store. The very stones that were metaphorically soaked in the blood of Christian martyrs were now being repurposed to build and glorify the holiest sites of the Christian faith. Nothing says divine providence quite like ripping apart a murder arena to build a cathedral. If you go on a scavenger hunt through Rome today, you can find the missing half of the Colosseum hiding in plain sight, camouflaged as holy architecture. Its stones are in the facade of St. Peter's Basilica, in the Gran Palazzo Venezia, the Basilica of St. John Lateran, and the Palazzo Farnese, among many others. One powerful papal family, the Barberini, took so much marble for their palace that it sparked a famous and bitter saying in Rome, quod non fecerunt Barbari, fecerunt Barberini, which means, what the barbarians did not do, the Barberini did. The saying was a pointed jab, implying that this supposedly civilized Roman family had done more damage to the city's greatest monument than the invading barbarian hordes ever had. And it wasn't just the big, glamorous blocks of stone and marble that were carted away. If the popes and nobles were taking the skeleton, the scrap metal dealers came for the ligaments. Remember those 300 tons of iron clamps that held the massive blocks together? In the Middle Ages, iron was expensive and vital for making weapons, tools, and horseshoes. So, an army of scavengers descended on the remaining walls, hacking away at the stone with chisels and hammers to dig out the valuable metal clamps that were buried inside. Each clamp they stole further weakened the walls, causing more cracks and collapses. This destructive process is what left behind the thousands of pockmarks and ugly holes that you can still see all over the Colosseum's walls today. They are the visible scars of centuries of petty theft. The Colosseum wasn't destroyed in one dramatic collapse. It was slowly dismantled by centuries of practicality. Piece by piece, the amphitheatre bled into the city around it. The earth had delivered the rubble, and for the next few centuries, the people of Rome, from the powerful to the poor, came to pick up their delivery. Over the centuries, as its stones were being carted off to build the future of Rome, the Colosseum became a parody of its former self. But the story of its transformation doesn't end with it being a quarry. While the powerful were taking its bones, a different, humbler kind of life began to take root in the hollowed-out spaces that remained. The world's greatest arena was about to start its strangest chapter yet, reinventing itself not as a stadium or a fortress, but as a mall, a barnyard, and a haunted garden, all at the same time. The arches on the ground level, once designed to funnel tens of thousands of cheering spectators in and out of the arena, became perfect, ready-made storefronts. The Colosseum turned into a medieval strip mall. Blacksmiths set up their forges, their hammers clanging away in the same spots where the crowd's roars once echoed. Bakers built ovens into the ancient walls, the smell of fresh bread mingling with the ghosts of centuries past. Butchers displayed their cuts of meat, probably without even a hint of irony, in the very archways where lions once tore into prisoners. Nothing says fresh product like buying your sausage under a centuries-old bloodstain. And it wasn't just shops. People lived there too. The Colosseum became a makeshift apartment complex, with families carving out little homes for themselves in its hollowed arches. Imagine waking up in the morning, stepping outside your door, and remembering that you live inside history's biggest murder arena. For medieval Romans, that was just Tuesday. Of course, these weren't luxury condos. Rain dripped through the cracks, rubble was a constant hazard, and occasionally parts of the wall would collapse without warning. But hey, location, location, location. While the outer arches were buzzing with the life of a medieval market, the vast, empty space of the arena floor found a new, quieter purpose. The grand stage that had once hosted naval battles and gladiatorial duels eventually turned into a giant pasture for sheep and goats. Nothing says the fall of an empire quite like livestock calmly grazing on history's most iconic murder arena. Travelers and pilgrims arriving in Rome during the Middle Ages would write about the bizarre sight. They came expecting to see the legendary amphitheatre, and instead found a sort of ghostly meadow, with herds of animals chewing grass in the same space where gladiators once fought for their lives. Imagine standing in the world's largest stadium and hearing not the roar of 50,000 spectators, but the gentle bleating of goats. It was a little anticlimactic, yes, but probably better for public health. The goats, of course, didn't care about imperial grandeur or architectural mastery. They cared about weeds, and the Colosseum, with centuries of neglect, had plenty of those. Plants were growing wildly in its cracks, on its stairways, and in its collapsed arches, turning the place into an overgrown all-you-can-eat buffet. Local shepherds thought, why not? Free grass. And just like that, the arena of emperors became the cheapest grazing land in all of Rome. But the plant life in the Colosseum was far stranger and more magical than just weeds for goats. As nature began to reclaim the ruin, it turned into something truly astonishing, a haunted botanical garden. With earthquakes opening up deep cracks in the stone and looters ripping out the iron clamps, the arena slowly turned into a giant, accidental planter box. By the time of the Renaissance, botanists began to study the flora of the ruin, and they were stunned. They catalogued hundreds of different plant species growing out of the cracks, many of them exotic and not native to Italy at all. So where did they come from? The answer is a haunting echo of the arena's bloody past. The seeds had travelled to Rome centuries earlier, hidden in the fur of the lions from Africa, in the bellies of the bears from the mountains of Europe, or stuck to the sandals of the gladiators and prisoners from every corner of the empire. The very victims of the arena had, unknowingly, brought the seeds of its future transformation with them. The result was that the Stadium of Bones became a haunted botanical garden, a living monument to the creatures that had died there, their homelands blooming again hundreds of years later from a crack in the stone. And of course, a place with such a history of death was bound to get a reputation, with hundreds of thousands of people and over 1 million animals having died within its walls. It's no surprise that locals whispered that the Colosseum was crawling with restless spirits. Strange noises in the night were obviously ghost gladiators, and a cold wind blowing through the arches must have been the souls of martyrs sighing. At the same time, Christians began to claim the Colosseum as a holy site, believing it was the place where countless martyrs had been executed for their faith. This created a bizarre double identity. The Colosseum was a place people prayed in, a place they avoided after dark, and a place they stole from, all at the same time. Only in Rome could a place be considered holy, cursed, and conveniently useful for building materials all at once. So, what happened to the missing half of the Colosseum? After this long journey, we finally have our answer. It didn't just vanish into thin air. It was shaken apart by the earth and then swallowed by the very city it once dominated. It became palaces, churches, fountains, and homes. The missing half is still there. It's just scattered across Rome, hiding in plain sight. The Colosseum didn't die, it was absorbed, becoming the very fabric of Rome itself. In the end, Rome didn't lose the Colosseum. Rome became the Colosseum. And so the story of the Colosseum closes, not with an ending, but with a transformation. But to understand the power that could build such a monument and then absorb it, we need to leave the city centre and march with the men who made it all possible. We need to understand the real engine of the empire, not its stone heart, but its beating one, the Roman legionary. And so the story of the Colosseum closes, not with an ending, but with a transformation. It was a monument so immense, so central to the city's identity, that even in its destruction, it refused to disappear. It simply dissolved, becoming the very fabric of the city it once served. But to truly understand the power that could build such a monument in the first place, the sheer force of will and organization that could conquer nations to pay for it and enslave armies to build it, we need to leave the city center. We need to step away from the grand, static symbols of empire and march with the men who made it all possible. We need to understand the real engine of Rome, not its stone heart, but its beating one, the Roman legionary. We are about to journey from the spectacle of the arena to the grit of the campaign trail, to uncover the unsung weapon that truly conquered the world. When we think of the Roman legion, a certain image instantly comes to mind. We picture the disciplined formations, the gleaming segmented armor, the large rectangular shields locked together in a tortoise formation, and the short stabbing sword, the gladius, that was so brutally effective in close combat. We imagine the thunder of marching boots, the glint of steel under a foreign sun, and the eagle standards held high against the sky. And that image is true, of course. It's powerful, but it's incomplete, because the single most decisive weapon in the Roman arsenal, the one that allowed them to march farther, fight harder, and endure longer than any of their enemies, wasn't a weapon you could hold in your hand. It wasn't the sword, the javelin, or the shield. Rome's true weapon was not just the gladius, but the ability to feed its armies anywhere, at any time, for as long as needed. The beating heart of the Roman legion wasn't the glint of steel or the thunder of marching boots. It was grain. The Roman military diet was far more than a simple ration. It was a masterpiece of logistics, a weapon of war wielded with ruthless efficiency. The empire wasn't built only on blood and stone. It was built on bread, pork, cheese, and vinegar. This might sound boring compared to stories of epic battles, but don't be fooled. This is the secret history of how Rome really won. While their enemies, the Gauls, the Germans, the Parthians, often relied on foraging, plunder, or giant feasts before a battle, their approach to food was chaotic and unpredictable. They might feast one day and starve the next. The Romans, by contrast, built a system. Their entire military machine was designed around a simple, predictable, and brutally efficient diet that could be transported, stored, and rationed with mathematical precision. This gave them a superpower that no one else had: predictability. A Roman general knew, almost to the pound, exactly how much food his army needed each day. This meant he could plan campaigns that lasted for months, conduct long sieges that would starve his enemies into submission, and march his legions deep into hostile territory, far from friendly supply lines, with a confidence that his opponents could never match. In the calculus of ancient warfare, predictability beat plenty every single time. This is because, for the Romans, food was strategy. Their ability to sustain their armies in the field wasn't an afterthought. It was central to their entire way of war. They could starve their foes into submission, not because their soldiers ate better or more luxuriously, but because they ate consistently. This consistency also acted as a powerful form of propaganda within the legions themselves. A soldier might endure weeks of monotonous rations, but he knew with absolute certainty that his ration was guaranteed by the state. Every day, he would receive his 3 pounds of grain, his portion of salted pork, his measure of cheese, and the sour security of his watered-down vinegar drink. That guarantee created a profound sense of loyalty and trust. Generals who provided food earned the devotion of their men. Those who failed saw mutiny. The great commanders of Roman history, Julius Caesar, Augustus, Trajan, they all understood this fundamental truth: feeding the soldier was feeding the empire itself. To march without the constant fear of hunger gave the Roman legion an advantage that no enemy could easily counter. So, for the next part of our journey, we're going to look past the battlefield and into the camp kitchen. We're going to deconstruct the myth of the legionary and rebuild him from the ground up, starting with the very fuel that powered his body. We will see how each man was expected to be a self-sufficient walking kitchen, carrying his own little pantry and cookware on his back. We'll explore the simple, rugged, and relentlessly efficient components of their diet, a diet designed not for comfort, but for endurance. We're about to open up the ration pack of a Roman soldier and examine the handful of basic, unglamorous ingredients that allowed this army to conquer and hold most of the known world. The sword may have carved Rome's dominion, but grain was the quiet force that sustained it. Our story continues not with the clash of steel, but with the grinding of wheat. So let's open up that ration pack. Let's look past the gleaming armor and the sharp sword and focus on the simple, brutally efficient, and sometimes downright unappetizing ingredients that fueled the conquest of the world. The absolute foundation of the Roman military diet, the pillar upon which the entire logistical masterpiece was built, was simple, predictable, and relentlessly efficient. It was grain. Each soldier, whether he was a hardened veteran of 20 campaigns or a raw recruit tasting war for the first time, was issued about 850 grams, or nearly 2 pounds, of grain per day, most of it being wheat. But here's the first crucial detail that highlights the logistical genius of the Roman army. This grain wasn't handed out as ready-to-eat bread, or even as bags of flour. To make it last longer on campaign, where resupply could be weeks or even months away, it was issued as whole, hard kernels. Whole grains are like little armored seeds. They are far more resistant to moisture, mold, rot, and pests than flour is. This simple decision meant that a legion's food supply was durable and dependable, a crucial advantage when marching through the damp forests of Germania or the humid swamps of Britannia. But it also meant that for the common soldier, the day's work was far from over when the marching stopped. I want you to picture the scene. It's dusk. A Roman legionary has just marched for 8 hours, covering maybe 20 miles of rough terrain. He's weighed down by his armor, his shield, his weapons, and his heavy pack, a total load that could easily top 60 pounds. His shoulders are aching, his feet are sore, and he is bone-tired. But he can't rest yet. First, he has to do his share of building the fortified camp for the night, digging ditches, raising earthen walls, the whole routine. Only then, as the sun dips below the horizon and the campfires begin to flicker to life, can he finally turn his attention to dinner. And his first chore is to pull out a piece of equipment that was just as essential as his sword, a small, portable handmill, the mola manuaria. This was a simple but effective tool, usually 2 circular stones, one on top of the other, that a soldier would have to turn by hand to grind his daily ration of hard grain kernels into coarse flour. Now imagine this not just for one soldier, but for an entire legion of 5,000 men. As evening fell, every Roman camp, from the misty hills of Scotland to the dusty plains of Syria, would have been filled with the same sound. Not the clang of steel, but the rhythmic, scraping, grinding noise of thousands of men turning stone against stone. It was a noisy, dusty, exhausting job. It was monotonous. It was tedious. But it was absolutely non-negotiable. Flour meant bread, and bread meant energy for another day of marching, another day of digging, another day of conquest. Once the soldier had his small pile of coarse, gritty flour, he had a couple of options, neither of them particularly gourmet. The quickest and easiest was to boil it with water and a little salt into a thick, hearty porridge known as poles. This was the ultimate Roman comfort food, if you can call it that. It was warm, it was filling, and it was simple. For men who had been marching all day in the cold and rain, A hot bowl of porridge, no matter how plain, must have felt like a small miracle. It was the food of pure survival, a dependable source of calories that could be cooked quickly in a single pot over a shared fire. The other, more common option was to bake the flour into bread. But this was nothing like the soft, fluffy loaves we know today. This was panis militaris, or military bread, a dense, unleavened, and often gritty flatbread. The soldier would mix his flour with some water and salt, knead it into a rough dough, and then cook it directly on hot stones or even on his shield, placed near the embers of the campfire. It would have been tough, heavy, and chewy, a purely functional food designed to be durable and filling. But for long marches or sieges, when there might not be time to bake every day, the Romans had an even tougher solution. They would double bake their bread, cooking it a second time until it was rock hard and almost completely devoid of moisture. This created a military hardtack called buccellatum, a food that was practically indestructible and could last for weeks, if not months, without spoiling. This was food stripped of all ceremony, designed for endurance alone. It was chewy dry and nearly tasteless, and probably so hard it could nearly break a tooth. A soldier would likely have had to soak it in water, wine, or vinegar just to make it soft enough to chew. This wasn't food for pleasure. This was food as an instrument of war. In its dry, unyielding texture was a lesson in Roman philosophy. It was the taste of discipline, plain repetitive, but utterly dependable. It reflected the Roman mindset that glory didn't come from living well, but from enduring discomfort and still marching forward. This daily ritual, the grueling march, the exhausting grind of the mill, the preparation of the same simple meal, day in and day out, was what forged a Roman soldier. It built a resilience and a self-sufficiency that their enemies couldn't match. But a soldier cannot live on bread and porridge alone, no matter how dependable it is. This grainy foundation needed something to wash it down and something to give it a little more substance. And the Roman solution for both was just as practical, and in one case, just as unappetizing. But a soldier cannot live on bread and porridge alone, no matter how dependable it is. This grainy foundation was the base of the pyramid, but it needed other components to make it a truly effective system of fuel. It needed something to wash it down, something to add vital nutrients, and something to break the soul-crushing monotony. And the Roman solution for all of these was just as practical, and in one case, just as unappetizing as the bread itself. So, let's start with what every legionary carried in his waterskin. It wasn't the rich, velvety wine of a Roman banquet. Far from it. To wash down their hard bread, every legionary was issued a daily ration of what can only be described as the Gatorade of the ancient world, a drink called posca. Now, on paper, posca sounds absolutely disgusting. It was a simple, sour drink made of cheap wine that had gone bad, or sometimes just straight-up vinegar mixed with water. Imagine, after a long day's march under a scorching sun, looking forward to a refreshing drink, and what you get is a lukewarm swig of vinegar water. To the modern palate, it would taste like punishment. But to a Roman legionary, it tasted like refreshment, safety, and even medicine. This seemingly foul concoction was actually a stroke of low-tech brilliance. First and foremost, it solved one of the biggest problems for any army on the move: unsafe water. Rivers and wells in foreign lands were often contaminated with bacteria, especially when thousands of men and animals were using them. A single bad water source could cripple an entire army overnight with diseases like dysentery, doing more damage than any enemy spear. But the acetic acid in the vinegar is a natural antiseptic. It killed off much of the harmful bacteria that lurked unseen in the water. Mixing this sour wine or vinegar with water not only stretched the supply but, most importantly, it made questionable water sources safe to drink. It was a simple, effective, portable water purifier. Beyond that, the tangy liquid was also strangely invigorating. When you're exhausted and dehydrated, a sugary or sweet drink can feel heavy. But the sharp, tangy bite of posca was surprisingly refreshing and helped to fight off fatigue on a long march. It woke a man up better than sweet wine ever could. It was cheap, plentiful, and practical, exactly what a legion required. Rounding out the core ration were two other absolute essentials, providing the fats and proteins that bread alone could not. The first was salted pork or bacon, called lardum. This was the legionary's anchor, a crucial source of fat and protein that was specifically designed not for pleasure, but for survival. In a world without refrigeration, fresh meat was a luxury that would rot within days, especially under the Mediterranean sun. But the Romans were masters of preservation, and the real magic here was salt. Slabs of pork were rubbed, packed, and cured with salt, a process that drew out the moisture and made the meat resistant to decay. This cured pork could last for weeks, even months, carried in a soldier's pack. It was tough, incredibly briny, and greasy, but it kept them strong. That protein rebuilt the muscles worn down by endless marching and brutal combat. As one historian put it, it was the soldier's shield against exhaustion. And finally, to complete the quartet of Roman rations, there was hard, aged cheese. If salted pork was the heavy, briny burden, then cheese was the modest comfort, dense, portable, and surprisingly nutritious. The Romans relied on firm, aged varieties that could be carried in a pack for weeks without crumbling to dust or spoiling. This cheese was a compact miracle, providing another vital source of fat, protein to counterbalance the endless carbohydrates from the grain. But its real advantage was its versatility, which was a huge boost for morale. A soldier could nibble on a piece of it during a short break in the march, but more importantly, he could crumble it into his bland evening porridge. A simple pot of boiling grain could be transformed into something far more hearty and satisfying when a hunk of cheese was tossed in, releasing its oils and salty flavor. For men who slept on hard ground and ate the same meal day after day, these small improvements meant everything. So that was the complete meal, a base of gritty bread or porridge, made more interesting with a crumble of hard cheese, a side of tough, salty pork for protein, all washed down with a waterskin full of sour, life-saving posca. It was a diet of pure function, a carefully designed system of fuel built for one thing and one thing only: endurance. But looking at this plate, a fascinating question arises. If you add up all the calories, was this actually enough food to power a Roman soldier through his grueling day? The answer is surprising, and it reveals an even deeper level of strategic thinking behind the Roman war machine. So we've laid out the standard meal for a Roman soldier: a tough, gritty flatbread or a bowl of porridge, maybe with a crumble of hard cheese, a side of incredibly salty pork, all washed down with a refreshing, if sour, swig of vinegar water. It's a diet of pure function, designed for durability and dependability. But looking at this plate, a fascinating question arises, one that reveals a whole new layer of strategic genius behind the Roman war machine. If you add up all the calories from this standard, state-issued ration, the grain, the pork, and the cheese, it comes out to about 3,000 to 3,500 calories a day. Now that sounds like a lot, but modern studies looking at the energy expenditure of a soldier on the march have estimated that a Roman legionary, carrying his heavy pack for 20 miles and then doing several hours of hard labor like building a camp every night, would have burned somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 calories a day. Do you see the problem here? There's a huge gap, a daily deficit of 2,000 to 3,000 calories, and this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a logistical failure. It was a feature, not a bug. The standard Roman military ration was never meant to be enough to fully sustain a soldier. This is where we get to the real, hidden genius of their system. The Roman army was designed, by its very nature, to operate in a constant, managed state of hunger. This sounds completely counterintuitive. Why would you deliberately underfeed your soldiers? The answer is that this built-in hunger gap forced the legions to become something more than just an army. It turned them into a relentlessly efficient machine for living off the land it was conquering. Supplemental food gathering, foraging, hunting, and buying from locals wasn't just an occasional bonus or something you did in an emergency. It was an absolutely essential part of their daily strategy. This approach had several brilliant advantages. It kept the central baggage train, the slow-moving train of mule carts that followed the army, much lighter, since it didn't have to carry 100% of the army's caloric needs. This made the legions faster, more mobile, and capable of marching deeper into enemy territory. It was a calculated risk that turned the very act of finding the rest of their dinner into a weapon of war. This was done in several organized, and some not so organized ways. First, commanders would send out official, organized foraging parties. These specialized units were called the frumentators. I want you to picture these men. They weren't part of the main, disciplined column of marching legions. They would move out ahead or to the flanks, small groups of soldiers slipping through the countryside, their job to collect grain from local farms, gather fruit from orchards, and secure any other supplies they could find. This was an incredibly risky job, especially in enemy territory. The frumentators were often isolated, far from the protection of the main army, making them prime targets for ambushes. Their success or failure was a matter of life and death for the legion. If they came back with carts full of grain, the army ate well. If they were wiped out or came back empty-handed, the hunger in the camp that night would be very real. Beyond these official parties, the soldiers were expected to hunt for whatever game was available to supplement their protein intake. The Roman army adapted to whatever environment it found itself in. In the deep, dark forests of Gaul, they would hunt for deer and wild boar. In the fields and hills of Britain, they'd hunt for smaller game like rabbits, and according to some archaeological evidence, even moles. This wasn't just a sport, it was a necessary chore, another part of the daily routine of survival. But the most colourful and fascinating part of this ecosystem was the swarm of civilian merchants, known as sutlers, who followed every Roman legion on the march. These were the ancient world's food trucks, a mobile marketplace that catered to the soldiers' needs. Every evening, once the fortified camp was built, these sutlers would set up a bustling market just outside the gates, where soldiers could use their hard-earned pay to buy all the things their standard ration lacked. This is where a soldier could get a taste of something different, a small luxury to break the monotony. They could buy fresh fruit, eggs, honey to sweeten their porridge, or different spices to liven up their meals. And this is where they could buy the Romans' absolute favorite condiment, a pungent, fermented fish sauce called garum. To us, a sauce made from fermented fish gut sounds pretty terrible, but for the Romans, it was their version of ketchup or soy sauce, a salty, savory flavor bomb that could make even the blandest bowl of porridge taste a whole lot better. So, you see, it was a three-pronged system. The state provided the core, non-perishable calories, the grain that formed the foundation. The army itself, through organized foraging and hunting, provided supplemental fresh food from the land. And the private market, through the sutlers, provided the small luxuries and flavors that made the whole thing bearable. This system made the Roman legion incredibly resilient, adaptable, and self-sufficient. But for this whole thing to work, for this machine to function, every single soldier had to be more than just a fighter. He had to be a self-sufficient machine himself, a walking kitchen capable of turning these raw, scavenged, and purchased ingredients into a meal, anywhere, at any time. And to do that, he needed a very specific set of tools, all carried on his own back. The daily diet of a Roman legionary was monotonous, functional, and grim. For days, weeks, sometimes months on end, his life was measured in the gritty texture of porridge, the relentless saltiness of cured pork, and the sour bite of vinegar in his waterskin. It was a diet of pure survival, stripped of all pleasure, designed to turn a man into an efficient, marching machine. The food wasn't meant to be enjoyed, it was meant to be endured. But when the fighting was over, when the enemy was broken and the spoils of war were secured, everything changed. When victory came, the Roman army would hold a massive feast, and food was transformed from a tool of bare survival into a roaring celebration of it. This wasn't just about eating. It was a ritual that was as much about psychology as it was about food. It was the moment the entire system of discipline and hardship paid off in the most tangible way imaginable. The contrast between the daily hardship and the celebratory indulgence was deliberately stark, and it was a powerful psychological tool. I want you to imagine a soldier who, for the last 2 months, has known nothing but the taste of dry, chewy hardtack and greasy, preserved pork. Now, the battle is won. The camp, which last night was a place of tense, disciplined silence, is now filled with the smell of roasting meat. The tough, salty pork was gone, replaced with fresh roasted beef and lamb, often from livestock that had just been captured from the enemy. The baggage animals, which were kept safely out of the way during the clash, were also slaughtered. Soldiers who had been choking down dried rations on the march were suddenly tearing into sizzling, juicy cuts, the fat dripping down their chins. And to wash it all down, the sour, watery posca was gone, swapped for real, undiluted wine, uncorked from large clay amphorae that were passed around with abandon. For one night the army shed its brutal austerity and revelled in abundance. This stark contrast was the whole point. The promise of a real feast, of juicy meat and good wine, was a tangible reward that a soldier could dream about while enduring the brutal campaign. It was something to look forward to, a light at the end of the tunnel of endless marching and monotonous meals. Roman generals understood this perfectly. This was their way of refilling their soldiers' morale after the exhaustion and trauma of battle. It was a way of reinforcing their loyalty, a demonstration of the commander's generosity and his role as a provider. A leader who shared the spoils, whether it was grain from a conquered town or amphorae of wine from seized stores, secured his men's devotion. Soldiers would forgive many hardships if they knew that victory promised feasting. As one historian joked, Rome's empire was built not just on discipline, but on the hope of a good feast after the killing stopped. The hard bread and sour wine of the campaign made the fresh meat and real wine of the victory feast taste all the sweeter, but these celebrations served an even deeper purpose. They reinforced the very bonds that held the legion together. Food wasn't just eaten, it was shared. Men who had survived the chaos of battle together, who had locked shields and trusted their lives to one another, now sat shoulder to shoulder around the campfires, toasting one another's survival. The simple act of eating transformed into a sacred ritual. Meat was roasted over shared flames, bread was broken and passed from hand to hand, and laughter rose above the embers into the night sky. This was especially true for the men of the Contubernium, the 8-man squad who shared a tent and lived as a tiny family unit. The victory feast was their moment to transform the shared trauma of the battlefield into the shared joy of being alive, deepening the small unit cohesion that made the Roman army practically unbeatable. Even the most hardened centurion knew that food could help heal what battle had broken. Of course, even in celebration, Roman discipline was never far from the table. The feast, though joyous, was a bounded, temporary release. A commander knew that drunkenness and overindulgence could undo what victory had secured, leaving his army vulnerable to a surprise attack. So, while the wine flowed freely, moderation was still expected. The celebration was for one night. Because tomorrow might bring another battle, another long march, and a return to the grim reality of the campaign trail. But for those fleeting, precious hours, the campfire was brighter, the food was richer, and the laughter was louder. In those moments, victory tasted not of vinegar and salt, but of triumph itself. This system of discipline and reward, of grit and glory, allowed Rome to dominate its world for centuries. But as Rome's power eventually faded, a new world was rising in the north, a world with a different kind of warrior, a different kind of loyalty, and a very different kind of feast. It's time to leave the disciplined Roman camp behind and step into the smoky, fire-lit warmth of an Anglo-Saxon mead hall. This system of discipline and reward, of gritty survival and glorious feasting, allowed Rome to dominate its world for centuries. But as Rome's power eventually faded in the West, A new world was rising in the north. A world with a different kind of warrior, a different kind of loyalty, and a very different kind of feast. It's time to leave the disciplined, open-air Roman camp behind, to travel away from the sun-baked stone of the Mediterranean and head north, into the misty forests and long, cold winters of the Anglo-Saxons. Here, society was not centered in vast marble cities, but in long wooden halls, and power was not projected through monumental arenas, but through the warmth of a shared fire. We are about to step into the smoky, fire-lit heart of the Anglo-Saxon world, the Mead Hall. From the outside, these buildings seemed unremarkable. Imagine walking through a clearing in the damp, northern European woods. You would see a long, low, rectangular hall built from heavy timber, its walls sealed against the biting wind. Its roof would be steeply thatched with reeds or straw, designed to shed the constant rain and heavy snow. Smoke would be curling from a gap in the roof, the only hint of the life within. There was no grand facade, no towering arches, no polished marble. From a distance, it might look like little more than a large, well-built barn. It was an architecture of practicality, not of spectacle. But to step inside that hall was to step into the very heartbeat of the community. It was to leave the cold, dangerous, unpredictable world outside and enter the center of the warrior world. Push open the heavy wooden door, and you would be hit by a wall of warmth and noise. The air inside would be thick and hazy, filled with shadows and the constant, dancing light of a great fire. It was dark, smoky, and filled with the rich, intoxicating smells of roasting meat, wood smoke, sweat, and the heavy, sweet scent of honeyed mead. Your eyes would take a moment to adjust to the gloom, and as they did, you would see that the entire room, the entire world of this hall, was dominated by one single, commanding feature, the central hearth. At the very center of the long floor burned a great fire that never seemed to die. Its flames would leap high, casting a warm, flickering glow across the smoke-darkened beams of the roof and illuminating the faces of the people gathered around it. In the cold, harsh world of the Anglo-Saxons, where winters were long and the nights seemed endless, this fire wasn't just a comfort, it was a symbol of life itself. It was warmth against the chill, light against the terrifying darkness, and the place where raw food was transformed into a life-sustaining feast. The hearth was the anchor of the Mead Hall, the sun around which everything and everyone in that small world orbited. This fire transformed the simple wooden hall into something greater than just wood and straw. It became a theatre of fellowship. Down the length of the hall, on either side of the fire, were long wooden benches, and on those benches, warriors sat shoulder to shoulder with their comrades, their iron mail shirts glinting in the fire's glow. The room would be buzzing with life. Hounds, the companions of the hunt and battle, would be dozing near the embers, soaking in the warmth. Servants would be moving tirelessly through the smoky air, carrying heavy wooden platters piled high with roasted meat, and constantly refilling the drinking horns that were passed from hand to hand. The sounds of the hall would be a symphony of life, the clatter of knives on wooden trenchers, the loud snapping of bones as warriors finished their meal and tossed the scraps to the dogs, and the constant murmur of conversation, punctuated by loud boasts, deep laughter, and the drone of a poet reciting a saga to the strumming of a harp. This wasn't the rigid, silent discipline of a Roman camp. This was a different kind of order, one based on a boisterous, intimate, and sometimes chaotic sense of community. The design of the hall itself was meant to create this feeling. The long, rectangular shape, the central fire that everyone shared, and the benches that ran the length of the walls. It all drew people together, facing each other across the flames. It was an architecture designed to erase isolation and forge a collection of individual warriors into a single brotherhood, a single war band. To be welcomed into the Mead Hall was to be brought into the circle of firelight, to be given a seat on the bench, and to be recognized as part of the kin. It was the place where a warrior's worth was measured, where loyalties were tested, and where a man's name could be made immortal. It was more than a building. It was a home, a tavern, a barracks, a courtroom, and a temple, all rolled into one long, smoky room. But this lively, chaotic scene was not without its own strict rules. Life in the Mead Hall was a constant performance, a piece of political theatre where every seat, every gift, and every sip of mead had a deeper meaning, and at the centre of it all sat the Lord, the man whose generosity was the glue that held this entire world together. But this lively, chaotic scene that we've just stepped into was not without its own strict, unwritten rules. Underneath the noise and the feasting, life in the Mead Hall was a constant performance, a piece of political theatre designed to show everyone in the room exactly who was in charge and precisely where they fit into the grand scheme of things. Every action, from where you sat on the bench to the order in which you received the drinking horn, was a line in this ongoing play of power and loyalty. The physical layout of the hall itself was the stage, and it was deliberately designed to create a visual map of the power structure. At one end, often on a raised platform, was the high seat of the Lord, placing him physically above everyone else. This wasn't just for a better view, it was a constant, non-verbal reminder of his authority. The long benches stretched away from him down the length of the hall, and your status was measured by your proximity to his chair. The closer you sat to the Lord, the more important you were. To be seated, at the feet of the Lord was the highest honour, while newcomers and warriors of lesser renown found themselves at the far end of the benches, near the door, in the cold draughts and the deepest shadows. Every plank and beam of the hall reinforced who belonged where. The lead actor in this nightly drama, the man on the high seat, was the Lord or Hlaford, and the very name the Anglo-Saxons used for him tells you everything you need to know about his role. The Old English word Hlaford literally means loaf warden or giver of bread. Think about that. The leader of this fierce warrior society was defined not as a conqueror, not as a king, but as the man who provided food. His power was directly and inextricably tied to his generosity. A good lord was known as a whoring giver, and he was expected to constantly reward his loyal warriors with lavish gifts of treasure, weapons, and of course, food and drink. The wealth he won in battle wasn't meant to be hoarded in a treasure chest. It was meant to be in constant circulation, flowing from his hands to the hands of his men. This gift-giving was the currency of loyalty. A lord would bestow upon his most valiant warriors finely crafted swords with intricate patterns on the blade, strong coats of mail, and, most commonly, arm rings of twisted gold or silver. These rings, or baag, were a warrior's walking bank account and a public billboard of his success and his lord's favour. A lord who was stingy, who hoarded his wealth and failed to reward his men, would quickly find his hall growing quiet and empty. Warriors would simply leave to find a more generous ring giver, and a lord without warriors was no lord at all. Generosity wasn't just a virtue, it was the essential mechanism of power. The supporting cast in this theatre of power were the warriors, the Thens. This was an aristocratic class of fighting men who formed the Lord's personal war band, a tight-knit group known as the Comitatus. These men weren't just hired soldiers, they were the Lord's companions, his household. They lived in the hall with him, ate at his table, drank his mead, and in return for his protection and his generosity, they swore sacred and binding oaths to him. This was the core of the warrior code. A Then swore to fight for his lord, to defend him with his own body in the shield wall, and, if necessary, to die for him. To abandon your lord on the battlefield, to flee while he still fought, was the greatest and most unforgivable shame. A warrior who did so was an outcast for life. In return, the Lord was sworn to protect and provide for his men. It was a sacred pact, a symbiotic relationship where loyalty was exchanged for treasure, and that bond was what held their entire society together. It was forged and renewed every single night in the firelight of the Mead Hall, and weaving this whole society together, often in a quiet but incredibly powerful role, was the Queen, or Quen. Her part in this nightly drama was crucial and complex. In a world of constant feuding between tribes and kingdoms, a high-born woman often played the political role of a peace weaver. She would be married to a lord from a rival tribe, and her very presence in his hall was meant to create a bond of kinship, to tie two warring families together and put a stop to cycles of revenge and blood feuds. But her most visible and important duty in the hall was as the ceremonial cupbearer. I want you to understand, this was not a servant's job. This was a position of immense dignity and ritual importance. As the feast progressed, she would rise, holding the great, decorated horn of mid. Moving with grace and purpose, she would present the cup to the Lord, his warriors, and his guests in a strict, hierarchical order that she knew by heart. Her path through the hall was a deliberate performance. She would go first to her husband, the Lord, acknowledging his authority. Then she would move down the benches, serving his most trusted and high-ranking warriors. Finally, she would come to any guests of honor, formally welcoming them into the fellowship of the hall. Her journey was a ritual that reaffirmed everyone's status within the war band and reinforced the social bonds that held them all together. With every step she took, she was reweaving the fabric of their community. These roles, the generous lord, the loyal warrior, the diplomatic queen, were the foundation of Mead Hall life. But this social order wasn't just understood, it had to be constantly renewed and performed through a series of powerful rituals. And to see these rituals in action, we need look no further than the pages of the greatest story ever to come out of a Mead Hall, the Epic of Beowulf. These roles, the generous lord, the loyal warrior, the diplomatic queen, were the foundation of Mead Hall life. But this social order wasn't just a static concept that everyone understood. It had to be constantly performed, reinforced, and renewed through a series of powerful, unwritten rituals. These were the moments when the bonds of the war band were forged in the firelight, tested before comrades, and sealed in drink and treasure. And to see these rituals in action, to get the clearest possible window into this lost world, we need look no further than the pages of the greatest story ever to come out of a Mead Hall, the epic poem of Beowulf. This tale, full of monsters and heroes, is also our best surviving guide to the inner workings of this warrior society, and in its verses we can see the entire cycle of Mead Hall life play out perfectly. The first and perhaps most important ritual was the formal boast, or in Old English, the Gealp. Now, this wasn't just a warrior bragging about how tough he was. It was a sacred, public vow, a formal speech that was part poetry, part legal contract. In the story, the great hero Beowulf travels to Denmark to help King Hrothgar, whose magnificent Mead Hall, Heorot, has been terrorized for years by the man-eating monster Grendel. When Beowulf arrives, he doesn't just say, "I'm here to kill your monster." He stands before the assembled Danish warriors in the Great Hall, and he delivers a formal boast. He recounts his past victories, his heroic resume. He tells the hall how he drove giants into chains and hunted sea monsters in the dark of the night sea. This wasn't just empty bragging, it was his way of establishing his credentials. But then came the most important part. After recounting his past, he made a binding promise for the future. He declared that he would face the monster Grendel that very night, and that he would do it with his bare hands, without a sword or a shield. He would either win glory by killing the beast, or he would die trying. By making this public oath in front of the entire war band with their lord as his witness, Beowulf staked his honor and his life on the outcome. It was a performance of absolute commitment. If he backed down or fled or failed to live up to his words, he would be shamed for the rest of his life. The boast was the warrior's way of putting everything on the line. Right after Beowulf delivers this powerful life or death vow, the second great ritual of the hall begins the serving of the mead. And it is the queen, Wealhtheow, who directs this ceremony. Her actions are just as important and symbolic as Beowulf's boast. She rises, holding the great, communal drinking horn, and begins a deliberate, graceful journey through the hall. This is not the act of a servant, it is the performance of a diplomat. First, she presents the cup to her husband, King Hrothgar, the lord of the hall. acknowledging his authority. Then she moves down the long benches, serving the Danish warriors in their proper hierarchical order. Her path is a reaffirmation of the hall's social structure. Finally, she comes to her guest of honor, the hero who has just staked his life for their cause. She offers the cup to Beowulf. This moment is thick with meaning. By accepting the cup from her hands, Beowulf is formally accepted into their circle. The queen, acting as the peace weaver and the conscience of the community, has just sealed the pact. He has made his promise, and now she, on behalf of her people, has formally welcomed him and entrusted their fate to his hands. Her journey through the hall is a quiet, powerful ritual that transforms a foreign warrior into a trusted champion, weaving him into the fabric of their fellowship. And finally, after the battle is won, comes the third great ritual, the gift-giving. After Beowulf defeats Grendel in a ferocious, bare-handed struggle, ripping the monster's arm from its socket, the hall that was once a place of terror is now filled with joyous celebration. And this is the moment when the Lord, King Hrothgar, must fulfill his primary duty. He must become the great ring giver. In a grand ceremony, Hrothgar showers Beowulf with a staggering amount of treasure. The poem lists the gifts in loving detail: a golden banner, a magnificent helmet, a shining coat of mail, and a priceless, ancient sword. He also gives him 8 magnificent horses with gold-plated bridles. These gifts weren't just a payment for a job well done. In this society, they were the physical symbols of honor, loyalty, and the sacred bond between a warrior and his ring giver. By bestowing these treasures upon Beowulf in front of the entire court, Hrothgar is not just making him a rich man, he is publicly affirming his status as a hero of the highest order. The treasure is the tangible proof of his glory. These 3 rituals, the boast, the cup ceremony, and the gift-giving, form a complete cycle that was at the very heart of Mead Hall life. It was a cycle of promise, acceptance, and reward. A warrior makes a vow, the community formally accepts his pledge, and if he succeeds, the Lord rewards his courage with treasure and fame. This was the engine that powered their entire warrior society, a system of reciprocal obligation performed nightly on the fire-lit stage of the Mead Hall. These roles and rituals were the software that ran the Mead Hall, the code of conduct that bound warriors to their lords and to each other. But this entire social world was built upon a much older and more profound foundation, their relationship with time itself. For the Anglo-Saxons, time wasn't a straight line of dates on a calendar like we have today. It wasn't something to be measured in neat, abstract numbers on a page. Their lives were bound to the rhythms of the natural world, to a great cyclical wheel that was constantly turning with the seasons. They lived by a clock they could see and feel the rise and fall of the sun, the waxing and waning of the moon, the greening of the fields in the spring, and the withering of the leaves in the fall. Their lives were a circle of planting and harvest, of cold and warmth, of hunger and plenty, and their festivals weren't just parties or holidays. They were the essential, sacred rituals that marked the turning points on this great wheel, the moments that held the entire community together. Our best guide to this lost world is an 8th century English monk known as the Venerable Bede. In a work called The Reckoning of Time, Bede, a Christian, looked back and recorded the old pagan names for the months of the year that his ancestors had used. And this list is like a secret window into their entire worldview. It tells a story. For example, the month we call November, they called Blot Mona, which means blood sacrifice month. The time of year when they would slaughter their excess livestock before the winter and make sacrifices to their gods. September was Halig Mona, the Oli month, or harvest month, the time of the harvest festival. April was Euster Mona, named after a goddess called Euster, a name we'll come back to. This calendar is a story of a people whose lives revolved around farming, the changing of the seasons, and their relationship with their gods. It was a calendar of actions, not of abstract dates. And no time of year was more significant, more dangerous, or more in need of ritual than the dead of winter. As the harvest was brought in and Blotmona passed, the world began to shrink. The days grew shorter and shorter, the nights longer and longer. A deep, biting cold would settle over the land, freezing the rivers and blanketing the fields in snow. For a people living so close to nature, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a time of real, existential fear. The sun grew weaker every day, and the darkness seemed to press in on their small, fire-lit halls. It was in this moment, when winter was at its darkest and coldest, that the Anglo-Saxons held their most important festival, Yule. This wasn't a quiet, cozy holiday. It was a loud, defiant, 12-day-long party against the darkness, a celebration centered on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. The central ritual of Yule was the fire itself, in the form of the Yule log, a massive oak or ash log. Sometimes an entire tree trunk would be ceremonially hauled from the frozen forest into the mead hall. This was a communal effort, a symbol of the community working together. Once inside, this enormous log was heaved into the central hearth and set ablaze. The intention was for this single log to burn for all 12 days and nights of the festival, a constant, roaring blaze that pushed back the oppressive gloom. The Yule log was more than just a source of warmth. It was a powerful act of sympathetic magic, a living symbol that light and life would endure, and a promise that the sun, which was now at its weakest, would be reborn and return to warm the world again. This was also a time when the veil between the human world and the spirit world felt dangerously thin. Yule was closely associated with the chief of their gods, Woden, the Norse Odin, and the terrifying myth of the wild hunt. It was believed that during this dark time of year, Woden would lead a ghostly procession of gods, spirits, and the souls of the dead on a furious hunt across the winter sky. To be caught outside during the wild hunt was to risk being swept away into the underworld. So, people stayed inside their halls, close to the fire, feasting and drinking, their celebration a defiant answer to the ghostly chaos raging outside. But the main event of the Yule celebration, the ritual at its very heart, involved the sacrifice of the Sonaglolta, the Yule boar. A boar, an animal that was sacred to the fertility god, often called Ing or Freyr, was brought into the packed, fire-lit mead hall. This animal was a symbol of life, abundance, and good fortune. But before it was sacrificed and eaten, the most important ceremony of the year took place. One by one, the warriors would come forward, lay their hands on the boar's bristles, and swear a solemn, public oath, a heat-stranging. Standing before their lord and their comrades, they would publicly declare the great deeds they would accomplish in the year to come. A warrior might vow to slay a rival king, to win a great battle, or to sail across the sea in search of treasure. These were not idle boasts, they were sacred vows made upon a holy animal, witnessed by the entire community. In its essence, this was the origin of our own New Year's resolutions, a way of leaving the dark old year behind and making a bold promise for the new one. After the oaths were sworn, the boar was sacrificed, its meat roasted in the hearth, and its life-giving energy feasted upon by the community, sealing their vows and fueling their hope for the year to come. Yule was the ultimate expression of the Anglo-Saxon spirit, a celebration of survival, a defiant stand against the darkness, and a hopeful promise for the future, all centered around the life-giving warmth of the fire. But Yule was only one point on the great wheel, the moment of deepest darkness. As the great log in the mead hall burned down to embers and the days, almost imperceptibly at first, began to lengthen, the community's focus would shift. They had survived the dark. Now, they had to prepare for the return of the light. The spring festival was the other bookend to their year, a time of renewal, rebirth, and fertility after the long, cold winter. As the frost finally loosened its grip on the earth and the first green shoots broke through the soil, the Anglo-Saxons turned to rituals that celebrated the planet's great awakening. This wasn't just a quaint tradition. In a world where a single failed harvest could mean starvation for the entire community, these rituals were an urgent act of hope. They were a way of calling upon the gods to bless the fields, the herds, and their own families with the gift of new life. According to the monk Bede, the Anglo-Saxons called the month we know as April Ostamona, and he tells us that it was named after a goddess called Eustra, in whose honor they held feasts during that season. And right there, in that single sentence from a monk writing almost 1300 years ago, lies a fascinating historical mystery, because Bede is our one and only Anglo-Saxon source who ever mentions a goddess named Eustra. That's it, one line. There are no poems about her, no carvings, no other historical accounts that name her. All the popular modern ideas about her, that she was a great fertility goddess whose sacred symbols were hares and eggs, are not found in any ancient Anglo-Saxon texts. Those connections were made much, much later, mostly by 19th century folklorists like the famous Jacob Grimm, who were trying to reconstruct a lost mythology. While hares and eggs were certainly ancient symbols of fertility and rebirth in many cultures, their specific link to a forgotten Anglo-Saxon goddess named Eustra is on very shaky historical ground. The modern pagan image of the festival of Ostara is really a myth about a myth, a beautiful but largely modern attempt to reconstruct a belief system that has been lost to time. This brings us to the great question: if these pagan festivals like Yule and the Feast of Eustra were so important, so central to their culture, how did they disappear? The answer is they didn't. They were taken over. The key to understanding this process, the absolute smoking gun, comes from a remarkable letter written in the year 601 CE by Pope Gregory the Great to a missionary named Abbot Mellitus, who was on his way to England to help convert the pagan Anglo-Saxons. This letter lays out a brilliant strategy for converting a whole people, a masterclass in marketing a new religion that is as cunning as it is insightful. Pope Gregory understood human nature. He knew that you couldn't just show up and tell people that everything they'd ever believed was wrong, and that they had to stop all their most cherished traditions. That would just lead to resistance. So he proposed a different approach. First, he instructed his missionaries not to destroy the pagan temples. He knew that these were sacred places, locations that the people were already used to gathering at, places that held deep meaning for them. So, he said, don't tear them down. Instead, just go inside, cleanse them with holy water, build a new Christian altar, and place the relics of saints there. The goal was to keep the physical buildings, the familiar packaging, but to completely change what happened inside them. He gave similar, even more brilliant, instructions for their festivals. He wrote that he knew the Saxons were accustomed to sacrificing many oxen to their gods and holding huge communal feasts. Instead of trying to ban these parties, a move that would have been deeply unpopular, he told his missionaries to co-opt them. On important Christian holidays, like the feast days of the martyrs, the people should be allowed to build their traditional huts of branches around the newly consecrated churches and have their big feasts, just as they always had. The only difference, he wrote, was that now they should be killing the animals, not as a sacrifice to the devil, but in praise of God. It was a hostile takeover disguised as a gentle merger by keeping the familiar and beloved traditions, the sacred places and the communal parties, but changing the religious meaning behind them. The church hollowed out the old pagan beliefs from the inside. And this incredibly clever strategy of blending old and new beliefs is the reason that the echoes of that lost pagan world still linger with us today. The old ways weren't erased, they were simply written over, leaving behind a faint but fascinating trace of a world that lived and died by the turning of the great wheel of the year. The great midwinter festival of Yule, with its defiant fires, its feasting against the darkness, and its 12-day duration was cleverly rebranded as Christmas, and that's why, even today, we still hear people talk about Yule logs and the Yuletide season. And that spring festival, the one held in the month that Bede called Ostamona. It gave its very name to the most important Christian holiday of all, Easter. The name of the holiday itself is a ghost, a linguistic echo of a pagan past. The great wheel of the year kept turning. But now the festivals that marked its passage had new names and a new meaning. And that, in the end, is the thread that ties all of our stories tonight together, from the Colosseum of Rome, a monument that was absorbed and repurposed into the very fabric of the city, to the pagan festivals of the Anglo-Saxons, which were absorbed and repurposed into the very fabric of our modern calendar. These ancient worlds may be gone, but they are not entirely lost. They are sleeping just beneath the surface of our own, their stories waiting to be told.